Hello and welcome to the June 1st podcast. My name is Ethan Moriarty, and as always, thank you for tuning in. To find more June 1st content, you can always check out the June 1st YouTube channel. If you search June 1st with the first spelt out, it should be the first channel result. This is where we have all of our engineering-related videos as well as storm chase footage. If you go on to Twitter, you can find my personal handle at eMoriartyWX, the June 1st handle at June 1st WX, and on Instagram there is the June 1st Instagram page, which is at June 1st Weather. In all cases, once again, the first is spelt out First. And with that said, we're going to jump right into today's episode. No podcast guest today. Instead, it's going to be a solo episode, so you're just going to have to endure with my voice, unfortunately. Maybe my voice is soothing to you, I'm not quite sure. But besides that, let's get into a little bit about June 1st and kind of the origins of that. I know it's been covered in the pilot episode, but more of the engineering technical side of things and why we do what we do. If you hadn't listened to the pilot episode, I can give a brief rundown in terms of how June 1st originally started. Back in 2018, I decided to take the initiative based off of my guiding question at Quinnipiac University. I just finished up my freshman year in 2018, and as a part of our freshman seminar class, we had to come up with a question to shape our career around at Quinnipiac University. And my question was, how can we better understand weather in order to save more lives? So I had a very engaging professor for that class, and he encouraged me to do a lot with this question, and I took it very seriously, unlike most of my fellow peers in that class. But, I felt as though it was a good opportunity to kind of pursue something that I enjoyed doing, especially since I wasn't a meteorology major, and that wasn't offered at Quinnipiac, obviously. I pursued engineering because that's, I felt, the best way I could make a contribution to the weather community given my skill set as a tinkerer and someone that has a very mechanical inclination. So as a mechanical engineer, I decided to approach the weather question from an engineering perspective, and that's what led to that question in my first year seminar class where I came up with said question. So I wrote a lot of essays about it and kind of laid out a plan in terms of what could be done and talked about how engineering methods could be useful in order to kind of build the tools for understanding weather in the future. So I did that in my fall semester of my freshman year, which is the fall of 2017. Moving forward into the spring of 2018, the question kind of was set aside for a little bit as that class had ended, but I still had this framework kind of put in place and was motivated to do something about it, even though, studies kind of took precedent at that time with more of my math-based and beginner engineering classes, I should say. So I moved forward with the classes and kind of got into my academic rigor, I guess you could say. The semester wrapped up in May, and then May 15th, 2018 happened, a moderate risk day, which I detailed the story of in a couple podcast episodes. My brother's episode 6, I believe. No, episode 5, Connor Moriarty, and the pilot episode as well, episode 1. So if you want to hear about that story, it's a pretty fun one. Go to either of those 2 episodes and you should be able to hear about it. But anyways, that was kind of the last straw that broke the camel's back, I guess you could say, where I was like, okay, I really want to do something in order to pursue the research of severe weather via engineering means. And that's how June 1st was born. About a month and a half later, after spending a lot of time planning, I launched a website and basically set out to establish this project as my kind of platform for showing how I was going to do engineering methods to advance the understanding of severe weather. So that's great. And that's why we're here today listening to this podcast. Started then in 2018, and we're still rocking and rolling in 2021. Before I get into kind of the projects that have taken place since then and the more technical details, going back to my influences in terms of how I got to be where I am in terms of really understanding the, I guess, background that engineering plays in severe weather research. It came down to a couple of notable characters in the weather community in previous history that shaped this path that I'm now on. Of course, there is the very famous names, but I want to kind of deep dive into each of them and why they impacted me in such a way that they influence what I'm doing today. And those individuals are Tim Marshall, Ted Fujita, and Tim Samaras. Tim Marshall was the first real engineer in meteorology that I became aware of at a young age. He got his original degrees in meteorology, but then got a master's degree in civil engineering, and he is, of course, one of the greats in storm chasing, doing it for many decades now, one of the original great storm chasers. And he also pioneered the way that we do damage surveys today and was instrumental in the development and implementation of the enhanced Fujita scale. I first became aware of him through a Discovery series called Perfect Disaster, and this came out in 2006, I do believe, so I was around 6 or 7 years old when it came out, I guess, because, yeah, that sounds about right. So I saw him, and he was describing how, tornadoes can throw 2x4s through solid concrete walls and stuff, and he was getting a little bit into the engineering side of things in terms of the damage that tornado wind speeds are capable of doing. So I kind of absorbed that just seeing the visuals of a 2x4 being shot at 200 miles an hour through a brick wall. And obviously that left a lasting impression on a young mind like mine who was already obsessed with tornadoes. Down the line a little bit, once the Storm Chasers series came out on Discovery, so circa 2008, 2009 time frame, I was a little bit older. Eventually, Tim Samaras was introduced to the cast, and of course, he was doing field instrumentation deployments on tornadoes that were of probes that he developed, and of course, he was in a number of projects. Much more recently, I think this was around 2017, 18, maybe right before I started June 1st, I read the biography on Tim Samaras by Brantley Hargrove, which details Tim's life to a great extent, and I found a lot of myself in him through reading that book, so it made natural sense that I want to kind of pursue this path of doing engineering in the severe weather research field aspect where we're implementing instrumentation into supercell thunderstorms or in front of tornadoes. So that's where that kind of influence came from. Obviously, his story is very well documented in a number of places, including National Geographic, and his biography by Brantley Hargrove and the Storm Chaser television series, though a little bit more of the reality TV side of things. You still get to see the action and kind of the overarching goal that he was trying to accomplish, even if it wasn't diving into the science as much. And then lastly, another engineer that was instrumental in kind of where I was at is none other than Ted Fujita. Many people don't realize that the great Dr. Ted Fujita was originally an engineer born in Japan and got his first real damage surveying experience being a young professor in World War II in Japan, right at the end of the Second World War, when the nuclear bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a bunch of engineers were tasked to survey said damaged sites to kind of figure out what the altitude was of the detonation of these nuclear weapons, because they don't impact the ground, they detonated above the city. And so Ted Fujita was in Nagasaki doing damage surveys where he saw immense damage, obviously. The first time nuclear weapons ever used, and the only time nuclear weapons were ever used in anger, which is, I imagine, a horrific sight. But he started perfecting his skills in damage surveil through that means. Eventually, he became fascinated with weather. I'm pretty sure he probably, if I'm not mistaken, this is coming from the American Experience PBS documentary that was on his life. He was always obsessed with the weather, but began doing observations on his own, measuring pressure drops when thunderstorms rolled through on top of mountains, and coming up with theories based on how weather systems work, and particularly severe weather, how they can be influenced by cold fronts and frontal systems. So down the line, he is presenting these ideas, and ultimately most people kind of reject his theories. But in the United States, I believe it was the University of Chicago and the United States Air Force were doing in their research of thunderstorms in the United States in the post-World War II era, where commercial aviation was really booming. So you have this perfect storm of ingredients where Ted Fujita kind of gets discovered doing his own thing, and he gets brought to the United States. And then eventually he discovers tornadoes. Well, I shouldn't say he discovers tornadoes, not like he found them in nature, but rather he found out himself about tornadoes and this problem in the United States of the fact that we experience the most prolific tornado outbreaks in the world. So that obviously became his focus later on in his career, with the 1957 Fargo tornado being one of his first real cases that he really started deep diving into, and then eventually the super outbreak of 74. He started to pioneer this scale that we could use to evaluate tornado damage and rate and classify tornadoes. Now, I won't necessarily say that the Fujita scale is perfect, even the enhanced Fujita scale. Many of us in the weather community like to kind of point out the fact that it only kind of takes into account the damage that it causes, but that's kind of the intent of it all, given Ted Fujita's background. There weren't the means of measuring tornado wind speeds when this scale was conceived. So yeah, maybe we can adjust the scale a little bit more. I don't know, with the enhanced Fujita scale, or whatever the next generation of the EF scale may be, we can get into that and maybe incorporate some of these mobile Doppler or mobile mesonet type readings. But nonetheless, this scale has become a staple in terms of tornado classification, and it all stemmed from what Ted Fujita did as the engineering side of his education, and kind of doing these calculations in order to determine how winds are able to inflict damage on the natural earth as well as human-made structures. Obviously, the Fujita scale, like I said, wasn't perfect, and they've revamped it since then in 2007 with the implementation of the EF scale, the enhanced Fujita scale. But, it is still a staple of how we classify tornadoes. Another thing interesting about Ted Fujita that I just wanted to point out for those that haven't seen the American Experience documentary on him on PBS, I highly recommend that you check it out. But Ted Fujita is credited to discovering microbursts after the Eastern Airlines Flight 66 crash at approach at JFK International Airport in, I believe, 1975, if I'm not mistaken. There was a thunderstorm rolling through the tri-state area there in the greater New York City area, and a microburst was ultimately responsible for downing this commercial aircraft, which I believe killed over 100 people. So obviously the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, wanted answers, and Ted Fujita, from his experience in the super outbreak damage surveys, had seen multiple damage indicators that resembled the Nagasaki damage, which is why I brought that up earlier, of a more starburst shaped pattern versus long, consistent swaths that tornadoes cause. And then eventually he conducted mobile radar experiments at airports that experienced these types of thunderstorms. So, I mean, any traditional, I guess, thunderstorm is, with the right ingredients, is capable of producing a microburst given sheer characteristics and the amount of CAPE available and what the storm is doing and outflow boundaries. We could talk all day in terms of how exactly microbursts happen, but nonetheless, they were able to use mobile Doppler radars to record microbursts taking place, and he was ultimately the one that kind of discovered this phenomena, even though most of the weather community at the time kind of neglected this idea. So it's this pioneering idea that Ted Fujita did as a meteorologist, but with this engineering mindset that I really was fixated to. Now that you kind of understand where I'm coming from in terms of my influences, obviously those are three tremendous names in this community. There has been a long-standing history of engineering in severe weather research, so I figured that it was a natural place for me to go, and I decided that I wanted to pursue this avenue of engineering and meteorology, since there are plenty of meteorologists, but there's only a select amount of engineers that are actually doing this kind of work, and I've noted them, obviously, the ones that were direct influence of me, or direct influence on me, I should say. So getting into actually a little bit more of the technical engineering stuff that June 1st does, I want to talk about where we started in terms of actually engineering devices. And this starts in the summer of 2019, about a year after the original inception of the June 1st project. So in the spring of 2019, I became aware of a program called QUIP-RS, which is Quinnipiac Interdisciplinary Research Scholarship, something along the lines of that. And it's an independent research grant that you can be awarded based on your grant proposal to do a project of your choosing, whether it be through a professor that's already doing research and you found it interesting and you want to tag along and help out as a research assistant, or propose your own idea and have a faculty advisor basically help you through the process, which was ultimately kind of my case. I went to my engineering faculty with this crazy idea because I've already been kind of scheming it in the background. And the fact that I already had kind of a big idea of what I wanted to do was largely beneficial in my favor, because it showed my professors that I was very motivated to get working on the project. So if I have any recommendations to anyone that's looking to do something similar, if you're in a university setting or, have a research idea and need some sort of support, do the background stuff ahead of time and really nail down what you want to do and show that you're motivated, because that'll convince people that are maybe not necessarily fully on board with your idea, or maybe they aren't fully immersed in the background of the idea, especially in my case where I'm talking to engineering professors about mostly meteorological type information and research ideas. So I had to kind of be somewhat of a subject matter expert with respect to what my professors are used to. So they're obviously used to engineering type research, but I was kind of going at it as I want to do weather research, but through the means of engineering. So I had to be well educated and go into these meetings as the meteorological expert, I guess you could say. Even though I'm far from that, I knew enough to convince my professors that I knew that this was a solid research idea and that all I need assistance is just the facilities and as well as more of the academia side support, where as a student I didn't really have much of an understanding in terms of publishing and making academic posters and writing papers and abstracts and stuff like that. So that's where they kind of came into play, but for the most part of the substance, it was my kind of brainchild, I guess you could say. So the idea of this QUIP project in the summer of 2019 was to create a proof of concept tornado probe. And I conceived this idea in 2018, but really started to flush it out for this grant proposal in the spring of 2019. I was lucky enough to get accepted for this grant proposal along with a bunch of other students doing other cool research, completely not related to weather. I was the one weather guy there, as Quinnipiac University is not an atmospheric science school by any means. So what I did and how I decided to tackle it was through Arduino microcontrollers. Arduino microcontrollers are an amazing, amazing tool. So basically a microcontroller is, we can simplify it as a mini computer, and you can write some code for these mini computers to execute whatever you want them to do given the limited program space and capabilities. You can only hook up so many different sensors or servos or whatever to a Arduino, depending on what Arduino it is, but they can do some pretty incredible things. So the brain of this probe was an Arduino microcontroller, and then around that were a number of sensors that were measuring parameters that we were looking for that would be useful in a tornado application. Or I should say a supercell research application, since that's kind of my target area that I was looking at, was determining what can separate a supercell as a tornado producer versus non-tornado producer. And the idea was, if we could measure locational and atmospheric parameters, we can compare that side by side with supercells that produce tornadoes and supercells that don't produce tornadoes, and see if we could identify trends that indicate whether it's a strength thing, whether it's an organizational thing that leads to supercells producing tornadoes or not producing tornadoes. Since a lot of the time with the National Weather Service, we have to warn storms based on just purely radar representation, but maybe if we can understand the environments that we're dealing with, then maybe we can refine the warning process and ultimately reduce the number of false alarms that get issued, as the majority of tornado warnings end up being false alarms, I guess you could say. Not to discredit what the National Weather Service does, but it is just a very difficult thing in a science, an area that we don't fully understand in terms of what storms produce tornadoes versus what storms that don't. So that's kind of the influence behind it. So in terms of the parameters that we're looking for, we're looking at locational, so latitude, longitude, and altitude, to give you a three-dimensional picture in terms of what is happening and where it's happening. So basically, you have this three-dimensional box that you could be working within, and you can compare that with radar data or some other data where at that time you can kind of track where this probe is going throughout the storm and kind of get an idea of what's happening. And that's where the atmospheric data comes alongside. So you have like temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, all those types of things alongside your locational data. So you can see a radar scan of the storm, know where the probe exactly is at a given time, because obviously the probe's going to be recording, the Greenwich Mean Time or the UTC time, whatever you want to call it, that's being beamed down from GPS, because we have a GPS sensor on board. I'll get more into that in a second. But you have an accurate idea of where this thing is within a reasonable resolution, a couple meter resolution, because that's what GPS allows for. And we're able to kind of really get an idea of what's happening structure-wise, especially if you had multiple of these probes in the tornado, or in the supercell, I should say. It's basically almost like a Twister type of situation. I'm referring to the movie Twister, where you have these sensors that are literally not whizzing around the tornado, but more rather in the structure of the supercell. And, you're deploying these in the updraft base and hoping that, they can be pulled up into the updraft and do their thing within the actual storm structure, where we can measure these things, and radars are having good scans of what's happening at the upper levels. And then, of course, we can get the 3D picture if you put it in, a GR analyst type of program, where you have the full tilt display of the different levels that the radar's scanning at. You get the full picture of the radar that's taking place. So we're doing this with a GPS sensor, atmospheric sensors, and accelerometers to kind of track the motion and the speeds and the accelerations that are taking place, because we can take the accelerometer data and the GPS data and kind of interpolate a speed from that by integrating, essentially. Granted, there's a little bit of error that takes place when you do that, because you're going to be losing some sort of constant, and it's happening at kind of chunked time steps, but it's enough of a picture to give us an idea of what's going on inside the storm at a reasonable time step. We were able to achieve a time step of 10 hertz, which is basically sampling 10 times a second, which is pretty remarkable. It's pretty difficult to do that with GPS, but there are certain GPS chips out there that are able to do it, and at certain speeds, you can run into some issues, particularly with the way these are designed, because they don't want hobby, or I should say non-military grade. Hobby's the wrong word, because you can get some really good GPSs, but non-military grade GPSs moving at really fast speeds, because they automatically will go into a shutdown state, because they could be used in like a missile application. So obviously, it's tough to kind of negate that, because obviously there's some real homeland security threats if you're building missiles in your garage or something and using, GPSs that aren't controlled by the military. So that's why commercial GPS has kind of shut down after very high speeds. Fortunately, though, that we estimated that we wouldn't be able to run into those types of issues given the speeds that we would be seeing. And then worst case, we still have accelerometer data, or high rate accelerometer data, that can kind of figure out what's going on acceleration wise, and we can kind of interpolate if in fact there are some GPS shutdown instances. But I believe if it's anything under 500 meters per second, we're fine. I believe that's what the requirement is. I had to do a lot of research on this, so GPSs are an interesting technology. Moving away from GPSs, though, we housed everything on an Arduino Mega, which is a large microcontroller that is very strong at processing. And so it's able to take the GPS data and the atmospheric data and the accelerometer data and all this stuff, crunch it into what's called a string, which in coding language is basically, we can call it a sentence. And it just basically prints out a giant string of numbers spread out by commas, and then packages that and then sends it over long-range radio, which is a little receiver, which is called the LoRa transceiver, long-range radio transceiver, that will then beam out the data. Then we have a receiver that a ground station would essentially have, that has antennas that would pick up the signal coming from this probe and basically grab that string that we packaged up and sent out via the LoRa transmission. And then we can pull it onto our computer and then basically tabulate all the data and visualize it however we want to. We use MATLAB in this particular application to generate 3D plots of data, which worked for our application. But eventually what we want to do is overlay it with the radar data that I was talking about earlier, and we have yet to kind of figure that side out yet. We're still a long ways from getting to that kind of point. But that was kind of the premise, and this was all contained in a little housing that was made from 3D printed material, and that was the proof of concept prototype. And this was designed throughout the summer of 2019. This project started right around mid-May, and by the end of May, Reed Timmer and the Team Dominator, I should, not the Team Dominator, but Team Dominator, and so Mark Simpson and their probe group that they do with rockets, basically almost the same idea. They launch these things via rockets into tornadoes to get kind of a sampling profile. I think they're more targeting the tornado side of things, whereas I'm looking at the supercell side of things, but nonetheless, very same idea in terms of what they're doing with these probes. They got a successful deployment, which kind of deflated me a bit, since I thought this was going to be, I thought I was very original, but this was really before I was very active on WX Twitter land, I guess you could say. So I kind of missed out on a lot of what was happening with Reed behind the scenes at the time and what they were doing research-wise. So I felt as though that if I was going to continue my thing, that I would just be called, a copier of what they were doing. But nonetheless, I reached out to Team Dominator, and they were very, very fine and actually very encouraged by what I was doing. So that gave me the confidence to continue the project and to not just scrap it in the middle, especially after I got this research grant through the university to actually complete it. So I completed it, made an academic poster, and submitted basically an abstract, and presented it at a university research fair, which was really cool. I got to give a little bit of a talk there about it, which was a really cool experience. And then I also brought it to ASME IMechE 2019, which is an international mechanical engineering conference, and I did it in their undergraduate student poster competition, where I got to talk to a lot of cool people and present my stuff via that poster competition in Salt Lake City, Utah, which was like I said, super cool experience. And I got to explore Utah and the Salt Lake City area a bit, which was really cool. I had never been to that part of the country before. So it was really cool to kind of explore that while, I should say, I don't know what the right word there is for that, while presenting the research that I love to talk about. So that was kind of the intro to what was going on. And this kind of took a little bit of a backseat throughout the year, and then COVID hit, and, it just kind of spiraled from there in terms of, this thing kind of going on the back burner as I had some significant engineering work to do in terms of my academics. It was a very tough year, junior year, as it was 2019 and 2020. Then over the summer of 2020, I talked to my engineering faculty about making the QUIP project into a senior design project, so having a team to further advance the idea in the 2020-2021 school year, my senior year. And I had to do a lot of, meetings and stuff like that to basically convince them that there was still enough to do to make it a senior project worthy, and they were inspired by my confidence once again to execute as they had seen prior, that I was able to kind of get it done by myself, but they were just concerned about if it could be done on a team level, since I was so hyper-focused on the meteorology side of things, and I did my best to prove that there were a lot of applicable engineering things to do there. So then in the fall of 2020, This is when we really started working on the ASMS, which is shown on our website, June1stweather.com, under the research tab, which is kind of the principal project that we're working on now as the June 1st Severe Weather Research Team. And I had the fabulous team behind me of fellow classmates and engineers that are Alex Gentile, Seth Cornier, and John Augusta. They were my design team that I worked with very closely, and they really helped out and did a lot of great design work in order to put this final ASMS together, which is the Aerial Supercell Measurement System, which takes the original TIMP QUIP project. So TIMP is Tornadic Inflow Measurement Probe that kind of spurred this senior design project. And the senior design project basically was improving upon what the QUIP project was able to do through this TIMP platform and make it a full-blown system that could be implemented in the field. Basically, the prototype to prove that this is a full working system that could be used to research supercell thunderstorms. And it mainly revolved around optimizing the probe, which we did. We eliminated the housing, conformal coated everything, and tried to make it as watertight as possible or waterproofing the electronics as much as possible so that it wouldn't short out and then didn't require such a bulky housing so that the wind could carry it more smoothly. And then, of course, the aerial deployment aspect of the design, which is through a UAV, an unmanned aerial vehicle, which ended up being an aircraft, giant RC fixed-wing aircraft, which was a real fun to build. We built one, and on the very first test flight, it took off much later than expected, and we didn't give ourselves a lot of runway, and it crashed into a tree. We had to rebuild the entire fuselage. Fortunately, all the electronics were fine, which was a great thing. The battery disconnected upon impact, so there weren't any overloading of electronic speed controllers or blowing up of motors or anything like that, fortunately for us. So all the electronics, which is the main expensive part, the body was made from foam board and fiberglass, so that wasn't as much of a concern, as it took about a day to rebuild the entire fuselage. Just a good solid 10-hour workday just to rebuild it and kind of get it back to where it needed to be in order to perform what we needed to do for testing. And we improved the ground communication systems, and we were able to fly our plane and get a number of good deployments on some windy days to kind of test out this system, because obviously we weren't going to be testing it on tornadoes quite yet. There's still quite a bit of work that needs to go into that, but we basically proved as a team that we could implement a system to measure supercell thunderstorm characteristics, basically. And we could deploy this aircraft with sensors on board, deploy the sensors and get back and keep researchers safe, since a lot of this idea of safety and keeping the group away from the tornado came from the unfortunate fatality of Tim Samaras, though he did not die doing the research side of deploying probes in front of tornadoes. The El Reno tornado was enough to show that, tornadoes are still very dangerous, even though as storm chasers we may decide to get cocky and get close to them. They can still take erratic turns and kill even the safest and the best of storm chasers. So to implement a research system that can work miles away, since we can use long-range telemetry and powerful radios in order to control these aircraft and these sensors and get accurate data back, we can utilize those kind of technologies in order to keep research groups safe. And that's the ultimate goal of this, is to get valuable data whilst keeping deployment teams and researchers safe. So that's where that stands in terms of what we were doing as a senior design project. Once again, I'll probably have them on the podcast at some point. Alex Gentile, Seth Cornier and John Augusta, who made up the rest of the June 1st design team during that time, and I can't thank them enough for their contributions to making the first version of the aerial supercell measurement system such a great success. Now, obviously, moving forward, what are we planning now? This winter, the winter of 2021 into 2022, I'm currently working on the next deployment aircraft, which is a hexacopter, a pretty large-scale hexacopter. The fixed-wing aircraft was great, and it was a great testing platform, but ultimately I don't think we want to rely on a fixed-wing aircraft just because of the size it needs to be in order to kind of still be powerful enough to overcome strong surface flow. I mean, it's easy enough to take off, but then you're battling coming back, and you have to have a giant wing and a giant fuselage to kind of house everything, and it is just not the cleanest, especially if we want to deploy this thing fast. And the hexacopter made a lot more sense in terms of fast deployment. It can take off vertically, so we don't have to worry about a long stretch of runway or anything like that. It can just take off and go. So that's kind of the approach now. And this kind of was the original idea, but due to budgetary restrictions through the senior design project and what we were allotted for a budget, we couldn't successfully pull off a quadcopter / hexacopter / octocopter really with the budget that we had available, because it requires pretty large motors, and large motors are very expensive. So we had to go with much smaller motors, much smaller motors and less motors, and kind of rely on the wing of a fixed-wing aircraft for lift versus just straight up big old propellers and big old motors to lift us off the ground. So that's ultimately what kind of happened in order to get the version 1 working, basically. So with this new platform, we'll be able to have a long-range hexacopter setup that can deploy probes, come back, be deployed fast. I don't think it'll be quite ready for 2022. I want to really flush out the radio side of things and the communication side of things to really make sure that we have good connections over long ranges, especially with sensor packages, so we can relocate them for data. We can retrieve data from them, since the 10 hertz data rate that we're recording at, we can't do over LoRa radio just because of the limitations of long-range radio. You can only send really small packet sizes at a certain time interval. So doing that 10 times a second over these tiny radios is just not quite doable. So in order to get the full data picture at the 10 hertz rate versus the 1 second rate that we can do over radio, we have to basically retrieve the probes, and we're going to need strong radio connection in order to kind of pinpoint where these things are going to end up locating, especially once these things get close to the ground. Ideally, we're going to be doing this over open air terrain, because these kind of measurements are going to be most easily done in the plains, given the ease of being able to track a supercell efficiently from that kind of manner. So if that's the case, we should be able to get a good last transmission before these things hit the ground, and we won't be able to get any more data, so we can kind of narrow down a field of where these things are just from looking at where their last known location was, basically. And if you were to do that in like the Northeast, for example, if it gets to like, once it gets to treetop level, you're done. Maybe that's probably like the same altitude for the planes, but if your receiver is at ground level and surrounded by trees, you're going to lose that at a much higher altitude, basically, since your search field is already limited by trees. But if your ground station and antennas for receiving are in a very open area, you have a much better chance of getting data from much further away. It's the same idea of radars, and how they slice further and further up the further away they go. It's kind of like that with radios in a very simple sense. So we got to get the radio side figured out well in advance before we do any kind of deployment, so we can make sure that we can actually receive these things and get the full data picture. I also am working on the user interface side of things because we want to make this system as easy as possible. So we're going to try to reduce the number of things going on the computer side and just have a simple interface. And I believe my brother Connor Moriarty is going to do a lot of work on that, since he is a computer science minor, and he can use this as an internship opportunity to kind of get into the engineering a little bit behind these systems. So that's kind of the future for the ASMS, just more prototyping and flushing out the system to a more mature concept from the prototype phase that it's currently at. And then another thing we want to do is a lot more of sensing type of work with mesonets, whether we want to do mobile mesonets or just reduced small-scale deployable mesonets that can be used on mesoscale systems. That's something we also want to look into, but right now the aerial supercell measurement system is really the focus of our engineering efforts right now, especially with UAVs and deploying probes on storms. So with that said, I hope this gives you a good idea in terms of what we are doing at June 1st Severe Weather Research in engineering, and kind of where the motivation and some of the technical details are lying, basically, from where we're at. In the future, especially throughout this winter, we're going to be making videos dedicated to a lot of our engineering efforts, which you can find on the June 1st YouTube channel. So June 1st, spelt out JUNE space FIRST. If you type that into the YouTube search bar, it should be the first channel result. You can't miss it. The little black and white twister. That's our logo. So you should be able to find us pretty easily just from searching there. And we have a number of videos kind of detailing a lot more of the aerial supercell measurement system too on there. Other than that, that's kind of wraps up where I'm coming from with the engineering side of things. I'm glad you can now say that you are educated in maybe some Arduino and some remote sensing type of stuff. And I really want to thank you for tuning in and listening, especially if you've made it all the way through this. And I hope that you got something out of it and maybe learned a thing or two about some of the engineering greats in the world of weather along the way, and hopefully maybe got inspired a little bit and want to maybe pursue some weather research of your own. With that said, my name's Ethan Moriarty. This is the June 1st podcast, and I wish you all good night. Take care, everyone.